Everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Plant Powered Dog Podcast. Today, I want to welcome a really special guest to the podcast, Dr. Richard Pitcairn. Dr. Pitcairn is arguably the most well-known holistic veterinarian in the world. His illustrious career in veterinary medicine has spanned more than 5 decades. Dr. Pitcairn earned his DVM degree from UC Davis in 1965 and a PhD in veterinary immunology from Washington State in 1972. In 1990, Dr. Pitcairn began teaching colleagues a careful and systematic approach to classical homeopathy and nutrition, which is now known as the Pitcairn Institute of Veterinary Homeopathy. Among his many other achievements, Dr. Pitcairn is also the author, with his wife Susan, of the classic book, Dr. Pitcairn's Complete Guide to Natural Health for Dogs and Cats, which is now in its 4th edition. Dr. Pitcairn, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. There's so much more. I could have gone on all day, but I just want to let you know that, thank you so much for being here. You're just an amazing person who everyone I speak with who's come across you has told me just how willing you are to share your knowledge and your information and your wisdom. And that's what happened to me several years ago when you were one of the very first people to bring me along the journey of plant-based dog nutrition. And it's just changed my life. It's changed so many people's lives and their dogs' lives. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Quite welcome. The only thing I might just add for emphasis is I did have a practice in Eugene, Oregon for about 20 years. There was a homeopathic nutrition. Right, that's all I did was homeopathy nutrition, no vaccines, no surgery, nothing else. And it was very, very successful. So it just tells people that it can be, it's
Right.
not like something that's ineffective. It really worked.
Well, I mean, that's just, and I think all the years that, and I'm not trying to make you feel old or but you've been doing this a lot of years, and with that time comes something that a lot of practitioners don't have, which is the ability to see to see disease progression and how it's happened over decades in animals, in your clients, in the population as a whole.
Yeah.
And so I mean, I'm wondering, did watching this and what you saw happen in the companion animal population, did that influence the changes in the 4th edition of your book? Which, I mean, if there's anyone out there who doesn't know who you are, we'll just say that the first 3 editions of your really famous book, just it was a function of the times, I think, too, just sort of focused more on just that dogs and cats eat meat, And in 2017, with the 4th edition, you really changed that whole perspective. So did a lot of that come from what you had observed over so much time?
Yes, exactly. It was a process of learning over quite a number of years. And also what I was learning was how our world has changed. Our culture has changed. Our environment has changed. Things I did not know before. The first edition of our book, which was based on promoting kind of a more natural animal care program, was in 1982. And then the last edition was 2018. So you see quite a span of years there.
Right.
Yeah. So yes, very definitely. I learned gradually different things, which if you want to, we can go over the significant steps.
Yes, I would like to know what really most impacted you and what you saw that was sort of like aha moments in what was happening with companion animals. And of course, I focus on dogs. So in particularly what you saw in your canine clients, patients.
Yeah. Well, it might make sense to start at the beginning. When I went through veterinary school, I graduated in '65. And really, I had, basically zero training in nutrition for dogs and cats. I remember there was a semester on feeding horses, but I didn't, really work. I did some work with horses at first, but then dogs and cats, they just said feed commercial pet food.
Right.
So I didn't know much about it. And I
Which is a
didn't have,
lot what they say today, which is, a lot of
yeah,
people, a lot of vets still say that today.
yeah, I've heard that too, that they say there's not much training. I don't know why. It's sort of odd.
Right.
But
Right.
anyway, I didn't know much about it and didn't have much interest in it. And what changed for me, the first thing that was significant was when I was in graduate school working on my research and PhD in immunology. I was studying how to help the immune system function better.
Wow.
That's what I wanted to learn. That's why I was going to school. And I came across, I should say first, it was very good training. I learned quite a bit in understanding all of that. It's a very amazing and complex mechanism. But I wasn't really learning how to make it function better.
Mm.
How things go wrong with it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I came across this paper written by some doctors. It was someplace in Africa where they worked with children that had malnutrition. And they found out that nutrition made a big difference in how their immune system functioned. So that triggered an interest in me for the first time. And
Wow.
so I began to study more about using nutrients to try to help animals. And when I went back into practice, the first few years back in practice, that's what I emphasized was adding nutrients and vitamins and other whatever I felt I learned might be helpful. And so I was learning, I didn't know, I didn't have any training, but I was experimenting. And but then I can't remember the timing, it's too long ago, what year, but I do remember for example, one of the books, I'll hold it up here in case you can see it.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Food Pets Die For is a really excellent example. To read that was just absolutely mind-blowing because this woman, Ann Martin, that wrote the book, because her dogs had been sick from commercial food, did all this research and describes how pet food is actually made. And I didn't know, oddly enough, didn't know that. You'd think I would as a veterinarian, and I won't go into detail about it, except to say it's very low quality. It's a lot of disease material is used. It's not very pure, not very well processed. It's, very unhealthy, really, when you read the book. So that really changed me in the sense that I started formulating. It seemed like the obvious thing to do was to encourage people making their own food. That I couldn't see any other. There were some other brands out there maybe that were better. It's hard to tell. I did some research in that regard, but again, it was hard to really be certain about it. So that's when it kind of stimulated me to start thinking in terms of encouraging people to make their own food and have their own sources. Use organic, not over processing it and so on. And that was really the basis. That experience over several years was what led to our first edition, where we had our own recipes. And it was emphasizing using fresh and raw meat.
Right.
Because that's the way the trend was, and it made sense, I thought. Another step that was important to me was sort of the question was coming up, why were more and more animals having chronic disease and cancer? Compared to when I graduated, there's a lot more of it in animals now than there was then. And there has to be a reason for it, right? It's a good question.
Right.
Why is there so much? Why is it increasing? And there could be there's different ideas, some of it is heredity, people say. Some say it's, certainly over-vaccination is a factor. But I came to think that it was really what was in food. And I'll explain to you, I'm going to go over to a document and explain to you a really significant study that you're probably familiar with that I came across that really made a difference. And this was done by the Environmental Working Group. And
I love them. They're
2004, they did a test of newborn babies, and they tested the umbilical blood, the umbilical cord blood. In other words, the blood that was after they were born, the blood that was coming from the placenta feeding the babies. Have you
mm.
seen this study yourself?
I have seen this. Yes, it's very frightening.
Yeah, so what they did is they studied these babies to see what kind of chemicals were in the blood that the babies were living off. And they found in 2004 that there was a total of 287 chemicals in the blood, and which included pesticides and consumer product ingredients and waste from burning coal and gasoline and garbage.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
Of the 287 chemicals that they detected, it says that they know that 180 of them cause cancer in humans or animals, and 217 are toxic to the brain and nervous system, and 208 cause birth defects or abnormal development in tests that have been done in animals. So that's just amazing, isn't it? To think when you see that, oh my gosh, how much, chemicals there are in our bodies now, the hundreds.
And that's exposure before the person is even in the world, before they're born, right? This
Yes,
is
but
what
their
they're
mother
getting.
is.
But their mother, this is so we come into this world, or at least children nowadays do, really already toxic.
Yes. But then see, the mother has all those chemicals. That's because they come from her, which means the other members of the family have them too,
Right.
right?
Right. Yep. Yep.
So I might ask you, when you see that study where they found 287 chemicals, can you see the limitation of the study?
Oh, I would imagine that there are several limitations in that. First of all, what chemicals have been identified?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's the point I want to emphasize here for people that are listening to this. The problem is, as we're going to get into, is that the chemicals are in the environment, in the water and air, soil, as well as and in the food, of course. But the problem is that um, our culture, that's what I was saying earlier when we started, our culture has changed in that it has allowed the use of synthetic chemicals that have been developed, which is understandable. I mean, it makes sense that, you develop a new chemical for killing weeds or killing parasites or for medicine or whatever it is, cleaning your house. If some chemist develops a new chemical that's more effective, well, of course, it makes sense to use it, right? You could sell it and make money. The problem is that the chemicals will also then possibly have health effects, right? Because they've never existed on our planet before. They've been made for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
supposedly our FDA in the US, regulates that. So the difficulty is that when a company develops a chemical and submits it for approval by the FDA has 90 days to approve it. So there's no time for any testing that they can do. So they rely on what the company itself has done and what they tell them, right? And they get on average they get over 7 submissions a day. So up until this date, I mean this time now, I've read that there's 100,000 chemicals that have been approved. 100,000. So back to your question of the limitation, they only know how to test for 287. They don't know how to test for the other hundreds and hundreds of chemicals, you see, because they have to develop chemical tests for that purpose. Otherwise, you can't find it.
Right.
You see how complicated it is.
Well, and it's that old adage of you don't know what you don't know. How do you develop a test for something that you don't even know what that test should encompass?
Exactly.
You
Exactly.
know,
Well, you could go back. I mean, theoretically, one could go back and see what's been approved by the FDA,
right.
right? And then you could pay a chemist to develop a method of detecting it chemically.
Uh-huh.
But you realize, when you're testing, say, for maybe 300 or 400 chemicals, we still have over 99,000 to develop that for. Can our culture afford to pay chemists to develop tests for 99,000 chemicals? No, we're not going to do that, are we?
Right.
So the problem is that they say that of the chemicals that have been developed and released for use, it's less than 5% have ever been tested for health effects.
Oh,
And to my knowledge, none of them have ever been tested in dogs.
wow.
Yeah, so that's very significant, don't you think?
Well, and it brings back a term that you are responsible for teaching me that is just become the basis of what I pass along now to teaching other people, which is bioaccumulation. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
also how are these all coming together,
Yes.
and since the 70s where, paper plants were putting out these things and into the waters, and how they, so maybe for people who don't understand the significance of bioaccumulation and what that means for animal-based diets versus plant-based diets, because I'll just preface this question a little bit by saying that a lot of times people will say to me, well, but plants have chemicals in them too, right? So yes, we live in a toxic world, but there's that ladder that you talk about of bioaccumulation. So I'm hoping you can expand upon that for
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. It's I think it's very important and very significant to what we're talking about here because the term bioaccumulation is sometimes another term that means the same thing as food chain. People may have heard of that. So what that means is where these chemicals that we're talking about that are released, they're released in various ways into the environment, not all the same way. Some go into the air, some go to water when you wash your clothes, or in industry when they're producing, they rinse out their equipment or they discharge things into the rivers and so on, all
Right.
that. So the chemicals end up in the soil and water, come down in the rain. Um, they are applied to plants sometimes, they're actually some are used in agriculture. So yes, plants can contain these chemicals. But the animals that are used to feed dogs, the livestock that are raised and killed and processed for that purpose are eating the plants. That's what they live on. So they're eating the plants that have the chemicals in them. The plants, let's step back a little bit. The plants pick up the chemicals from growing in the soil and water because it's in the
Mhm.
environment all over the world, right?
Right.
So the plants pick it up. The animals then that feed on the plants, when those chemicals go into their bodies, and I'm going to refer back to what I said a moment ago, that when these chemicals are made, they're new to our world.
Mm.
They're new
Right.
biologically. So most of the time, oftentimes, our bodies really don't know what to do with them, so to speak. They don't have any way,
Mm.
over centuries, biological development has resulted in the ability to process things that are toxic. Animals and
Right.
plants have learned how to do that. They adapt to it. But now these are being introduced too fast and they're too different that our bodies and animal bodies don't know how to process these chemicals to get rid of them. You'll hear sometimes people say, oh, you do various things to clean their body, fasting, taking
Right.
herbs. But what's important to understand is that that will not necessarily rid the body of these chemicals. To remove a chemical from the body requires a process, usually done in the liver, where it's combined with another molecule and excreted through the urine. So if the animal body doesn't have the ability to somehow process it to get rid of it, then all it can do is store it somewhere, right? It'd sort of be like if every morning somebody brought a little cup of something to your front door that you couldn't recycle, you couldn't throw away, you couldn't use. What would you do? You store it somewhere, maybe in your garage, right? So that's what happens with animals. They store it in their flesh, in their fat and different tissues, because they don't know what else, in a sense, and they don't know what to do with it. You see, they can't get rid of it. So it builds up. So if somebody objects to eating a plant, say, well, this plant has some chemicals in it, so I don't want to eat it. They have to realize that the animal they're eating has eaten that plant thousands of times. So let's say,
and eating other animals that have eaten that plant.
Yes, it could be that too as well. Yeah. So let's say, for example, just for understanding, let's say that one plant that's going to be eaten by the livestock has a drop of chemical, let's just say, is a way of measuring it, has one drop of chemicals in it from the environment. The cow or the lamb or whatever it is eating it eats that plant and gets that drop in its body, right? Stores it. But now it does that every day. So by the time months or years have gone by, it's got thousands and thousands and thousands of drops in its body. So that's what's meant by a bioaccumulation. And simply put, the animal that's eating the plants is accumulating the chemicals in their body. So we're talking about a dose increase. If you were to eat the plant, you would have a very small dose. If you eat the animal, you're going to have a dose that's thousands or maybe a million times larger in quantity. So now we're talking about a significant dose.
Yes, that makes total sense. So I'm going to play devil's advocate with something that people like to often say, and when I say people like to, this is typically social media where everyone has their strong opinion, right? But like my husband says, you can have your opinion, but you can't have your own facts. So what you're saying are all facts. Now, what would you say to people? And I'm sort of leading this again because this was something else that you educated me on regarding pasture land. What would you say to people who come back and say, well, that's all well and good for those feeding their dogs commercial meat-based products? Yes, I agree with that. I would never do that. My dog eats raw meat, and it's wonderful and it's fine and it's human grade and all, organic. So what do you say to that? Do they still need to worry about this problem of bioaccumulation?
Because it's organic?
Perhaps it's pasture raised,
Pasture raised, yeah. Yeah, I think that reflects not fully understanding how widespread the contamination is. Because if you say, for example, you say organic, that means the animals haven't been given drugs and things. But that's just a small part of what we're talking about here. We're talking about chemicals in the environment, in the air and water, the soil, that regardless of whether pasture raised or not. So let me go to another reference here and read a little bit of this too, because it's relevant here to give more a sense of what we're talking about as excuse me, go to the right spot here. So there's a study that kind of addresses this, and it's called, scroll down to it here. Yeah, so this is a study that was done with wildlife in Montana. Now, wildlife, we're talking about living out in nature, right? So over the last 20 years, they've recorded health issues related to the exposure to these chemicals that are in the environment. And what they've observed is that they're exposed through the food, the water, and the air. And here are some of the effects that they noted in these wild animals. They had abnormal development of their faces.
Oh, wow.
They had eye deformities
Mm,
in deer and owls, goats, magpies, and so on. They developed congenital malformation of the thymus gland and some kind of impairment of the immune systems.
mm,
They saw in newborn animals, they saw skin rashes, blistering skin tumors in both wild and domestic animals.
mm,
They found disorders in the lymph system and on the blood vessels of their hearts. They found diseases and malformation of the heart and of the lungs. They saw in deer of all
mm-hmm,
ages, the enlarged right heart ventricle and emphysema of the lungs. They
mm.
found liver disease, liver tumors, enlarged livers, and number of birds and mammals. Abnormality of the sexual organs, not being the normal size or distorted. And then the last thing was not newborn animals not thriving, not growing properly.
And these are in wild animals. So,
These are
you
wild
know,
animals. So
right,
pasture raised are going to get the same thing, you see?
right.
So they say
Oh,
when
wow.
people ask about pasture raised, they're assuming there's no chemicals out there. And we're trying to communicate to them that there are chemicals out there. You have to get, you have to grok this. There's a lot of chemicals out there now in the environment. Um,
Mhm.
an example would be one of the most common ones is fire retardant chemicals in from clothing and bedding.
Right,
It's an interesting
right.
one because fire retardant, they add that to when clothing is made and sold, they add fire
Mm,
retardant chemicals, especially to bedding, sheets and blankets and things, because
right.
obviously the concern is that smokers will set their bed on fire. Well, the effect of that is because the fire retardants have been shown to be toxic. Fire retardant chemicals are then, once you purchase that material and use it, it's given off into the air of your room and from the air of your room out into the atmosphere. And once it's in the air, then it blows around the countryside. Fire retardants. They've measured it in children. And the children that have the highest levels of fire retardant in their bodies are in Alaska, because that's where the winds blow up.
Wow.
Another example is you've ever heard the term biosolids? Yeah, well, what it refers to is sewage sludge.
Oh, okay.
And so what that means is when a town or city processes its water, it goes usually into
Mm,
something like a pond, and the solids settle out, and the water supposedly is processed.
right, right.
And but that builds up. You can imagine and what's in that is all the stuff that's from cleaning our houses, from businesses, industry, medicines,
Medications that we all, yeah,
everything
that
that's urinated
that's
into a toilet. All that stuff goes down in the sewage sludge. So it's very, very contaminated, right?
mm,
Well, the problem was that the different towns and cities didn't know what to do with it. They had too much of it. So the FDA actually set up a contest to name it, and
oh,
they awarded a prize. I forget how much it was now. Let me go over here and look at what I wrote about it. Yeah.
so biosludge one.
Well, I'm going to explain to you what they did here. Um, yeah, $300,000
Oh, wow.
as a prize to the ones that would come up with the best name. So,
Mm.
so they had a contest, and the winner was biosolids.
Oh, biosolids, right,
So
right.
then the FDA approved its use on food crops,
Oh,
because so the most toxic material in our world is applied to food crops to as a fertilizer.
So
And
human waste?
everything, yeah, human animal waste.
Hmm.
Now, I don't know how extensively to food crops. I know
Hmm.
it is sold commercially, and you can go down and buy a bag with biosolids in it.
Oh,
But see, the thing that they test for, they regulate what's in the sewage sludge. They regulate 10 heavy metals and 2 pathogens. All the rest are not regulated. So it just gives you more of an idea of how much there's out here. Let me slip back here to this thing about the umbilical cords again. When we talked about the chemicals in the body, because I want to bring that to animals. Yeah, it is really significant because, I think it's a big factor in what, you asked me why is there so much of this disease? And I think this is the most important of all of them, I think. Okay, so a study was done by the Environmental Working Group later. I think it was 2016, and I have the reference here if you want it. So they did a study in animals, dogs and cats, and they were 20 dogs and 37 cats that were collected at a Virginia veterinary clinic, and they took samples of blood and urine from these animals, and they checked them for the chemicals that they could check for. And they found that dogs and cats had 48 of 70 industrial chemicals, and 43 that were levels higher than those found in people.
Hmm.
And they found include plastics, food packaging, heavy metals, food retardants, stain proofing chemicals. For example, Teflon was 2.4 times higher than people. Fire retardants were 23 times higher than people. Mercury was over 5 times higher than what's found in people.
Hmm.
In dogs, the blood and urine samples were contaminated with 35 chemicals, including 11 carcinogens, 31 chemicals toxic to the reproductive system, and 24 neurotoxins.
Hmm.
So that's very significant, isn't it? So it's telling us that now, why would animals have higher levels? Because they're eating at the top of the food chain. They're eating more meat and fish than people are. So what it comes down to, unfortunately, is if you're eating much animal product, meat and other, milk and eggs and whatever, you're getting the highest level of environmental toxins. And since dogs and cats are eating at the top, the most meat, then they're getting the most chemicals. Yes.
Well, so I
So
don't
what to
know if
do,
you, what,
right?
well, I mean, what to do exactly.
So you see so coming back to what I learned when I I didn't learn all this at once, stepwise. And when I found out about the chemicals that were in human beings, they're saying now that they're finding 400.
Right.
Is the average human in the US has 400 chemicals in their body. So, and that's what can be detected.
Right.
There could be more, as you said earlier. So then when I find out that's even higher in animals than it is in people, so then the question to me as a veterinarian advising people, then what can you do? Pasture raised isn't going to solve it. Pasture raised animals may have somewhat less, but they're going to have it. And they're going to have the result of bioaccumulation because they're eating all these plants that have it in their pastures. Right? So
Now,
what can you
pastures
do?
can be sprayed, right?
Well, if they say
If
pasture
it's
raised
not an
organic,
organic pasture,
supposedly.
right?
But even if
Right.
it is,
Right.
they're going to
It's
have all
winds
these.
and
Yeah,
right.
exactly. And
It's in
soil
the
and rain.
environment. Right.
So the question to me is, well, what in the world can you do then? How can you minimize the effect of these chemicals? And the only thing I could come up with was to feed less meat. You know, at
Yeah.
least you're reducing the
Makes
dose.
sense. Right.
They've done studies and people that eat a vegetarian diet versus omnivore or meat containing diet, and they find that the exposure to chemicals for the vegetarian diets is about 1% of those that eat the standard American. So it made sense to me that why not just feed then lowered on the food chain, and instead of feeding meat that has all this large amounts of chemical in it, feed plants that are, and use healthy plant, organic.
Right.
So that's why I
Right.
came up with the 4th edition. Let's feed plant-based primarily. Because, and surprisingly, once we started using those recipes, we saw definite health improvements.
Right.
So doesn't it make total sense that if you say, okay, cancer is increasing and increasing very significantly. Now I saw a report, I'm trying to think of the organization, the veterinary, mainstream veterinary organization published a paper where they said that they estimate 50% of dogs are going to have cancer in their lives.
Yes.
All right, so that's
Yes.
incredible, isn't it? That figure, because it didn't used to be that way when I graduated. It was uncommon. So you think it has to be a reason for it. Then you find out the dogs are being fed food that contains 11 carcinogens. Well, duh. Could the carcinogens be causing the cancer? Yeah, the studies are limited. It costs money to do research studies, and there isn't necessarily going to be a lot of financial support for doing extensive studies like this.
Right.
But I'll share another paper with you, which I think is significant, which is this was done in 2011, published, and the title of it is Analysis of Toxic Trace Metals in Pet Foods using cryogenic grinding and quantization of, I can't even read it all,
Right.
ICPM. Anyway, what they did was they tested 58 cat and dog foods bought from local stores and donated by authors and by pet owners. The samples consisted of 31 dry food, 27 wet foods. Of the dry foods, 18 were dog foods and 13 were cat food samples. The wet foods were 13 dog foods and 14 cat food samples. They were in cans and in pouches. And they gave the prices here, the range of prices. So it was pretty, it's a pretty wide range as best they could determine. They found, when they analyzed the pet foods, they found the highest concentrations of toxic elements were in the dry foods of both cats and dogs. Dog food had the highest result of 9 of the toxic elements. And I'll just give, we don't want to spend a lot of time on this, I know, but I'll just give a little bit of a summary of what they found. The way they put it, which I thought was a good way to describe it. They say a 50-pound dog that eats 5 cups a day of dry food, or 1 large can of wet food with the maximum contamination, would be consuming about 20 times the human limit of arsenic. You understand what I mean? What is acceptable in humans according to the FDA? Dogs are getting 20 times that. They're getting 2 times the cadmium levels. They're getting 120 times the accepted mercury levels for people, 120 times. They're getting twice the thallium. These are all heavy metals. 5 times uranium levels and 6 times vanadium levels.
And of course, most dogs are not, we're talking about these accepted levels for people. People are larger than dogs. So, you're talking really significant levels here. And these are in the meat, the bioaccumulated toxins in the animal products. Yeah.
So granted, it didn't test all pet foods that are out there. That would be very, very expensive and difficult to do, but it gives you some idea, doesn't it? When they tested a variety of canned foods and wet foods, dry foods, I should say, versus can, they found all these substances, just testing heavy metals, not even the other chemicals. Well, yes, honestly, we don't know all the foods, but then that's true for human food too. Not all of it's been tested. It's just too expensive and too complicated, isn't it? I mean, think about, 100,000 chemicals that we're going to test for safety. Well, we'd have to do studies in which you had control groups, right? Have human volunteers. They don't, actually, the way it's done, if you have what they identify as a carcinogen, let's say, through studies they've done in animals, they will not test it in human. Did you know that? They say it's unethical. So they only test animals. And they just assume that animals respond like humans do. But then how do we know that? And how do we know that dogs respond like cats or cats like dogs, you see? Unless you do a study. You see how complicated it would be?
So we have this dilemma, if you will.
This dilemma, right, the dilemma with a capital D.
That we have this toxic system. So we have this dilemma of this, yet given this, and the really what seems like, conclusion that you drew seems pretty obvious. What would you do to avoid these bioaccumulated toxins? You would eat lower on the food chain, right? That seems pretty non-controversial. It seems like a pretty intelligent, scientific way to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yet I know you have endured some backlash to that conclusion, as have I, and others who promote a plant-based way of eating for dogs. What do you think that stems from? Why do you think that people are so set on the belief that dogs need that they need meat, and that they are still today, the ones that sleep in our beds and ride in our cars and go to the vets, that they are carnivores?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, you and I know from just having done a little research on it that biologists consider dogs not to be carnivores, but to be omnivores. And that's indeed what if you study what animals like foxes and wolves and others in nature, they eat a lot of plant material, not primarily probably, but certainly significantly. And that probably wouldn't answer this objection, though, that they do, that they're not exactly carnivores. They still say, well, they're primarily meat eaters, right? Well, an interesting one with dogs. Are you aware of that genetic study that was done on dogs compared to wolves? Yeah. Yeah, this one is in Scientist magazine in 2013. They did the full analysis of dogs and wolves of their genetic material. And they found that because dogs for thousands of years have been fed basically primarily non-meat diets, they've adapted to it. Like historically in Greece, they fed primarily beans to dogs.
Right.
So anyway, they did a dog genome analysis back to 2005. They did 12 wolves and 60 dogs with 14 diverse breeds, and they found that quite a number of genes, 10 of them, that dogs had developed or activated that helped them to digest starches and fats and so on, just like humans. And so I won't go into a lot of detail here and bore you with this, but I'm sure you're familiar with it. But basically the conclusion of the study was that they can eat the same diet as humans and have the same ability to digest. And then there have been studies where dogs have been fed starch diets and they do just fine, or puppies growing up on it do just fine. So the scientific research says, no problem. They don't have to eat meat.
Right.
But then the people object. As your question is, why won't they accept that? I think probably it's an image they have about what the dog is, don't you? They have this image in their mind that the dog is this wolf-like animal, and they don't want to,
Right.
there's somehow, I'm just guessing, but somehow there's a certain amount of identification and pleasure in the idea of having an animal that's like a wolf. And then if you start to think of it's not really a wolf anymore, then that
Right.
sort of weakens your enjoyment. And you know, it is interesting too. I'll say this, risk offending some. um, the objection that will be brought to us is, well, it should be species appropriate diet. You should respect, you know, the biology, how God made them or whatever, how it's put different ways. And so they should be eating meat. That's their natural diet. And oftentimes then what my joke is, they're saying this with a lot of emphasis while they're eating a hamburger.
Right. Which is not species appropriate for
No,
a person.
we're not meat eaters. We're primates.
You know, and we laugh, and what it really does is speak to a reality that is not necessarily, you know, based, well, to opinions that are not necessarily based in reality, right? And it speaks to the fact that the realities of today, which you recognized way back several years ago, which came from decades of experience, we have new realities today. We have new realities of skyrocketing illnesses in these companion animals. You know, you thought to look at why this is, and we have new realities that you talk a lot about in your book that are hard for people, I think, to hear, which is that if you continue to promote this, feeding animals to yourself or your dog, you are promoting something that is you know, it's an animal welfare situation for yeah.
It
You know,
is. I understand that challenge, and people can be easily offended by that too, because if you say, you're kind of saying to them in a way, if you really cared about animals, you wouldn't want to be killing these other ones,
right.
you know. But you know, you raise a really important point. We're getting to a point in our world where we can't afford for the majority of people and animals to be eating other animals. We just don't have the resources. We're cutting down the rainforest to grow soybeans to feed cattle. You know, it just can't keep it up. It's not possible. Eventually, it's going to be forced on us to cut back off on this. The early years of my veterinary work, I worked with livestock and animals raised in various ways, a whole range of animals raised in farms and other. When I worked
Right.
up at the university before my graduate program, I was in charge of a large animal clinic reception area, and then we'd go out to farms and things. So I saw all this stuff. I saw how animals are raised. I saw, you know, they express feelings and sensitivities just like other animals. There's no difference really. And they certainly don't want to be killed. I can quite assure you of that. So,
Right.
so it wasn't that hard for me to take on that, accept the idea that if I really care about animals, I don't want to kill them. And because I wasn't so much attached to dogs versus cats or whatever as I was to animals. I cared about animals. That's why I went into veterinary medicine. And sometimes it's kind of a joke, but sometimes people will, you know, if I go somewhere and maybe a veterinary group or something, you know, and they know I'm a veterinarian, and they're having lunch, and I'll say, "Do you have any plant-based dishes here? I don't eat animals." And oh, you don't, you know? And I said, "No, I don't eat my patients."
Exactly. You
Yeah.
are really leading the way into as being brave as a veterinarian to come out there and show a different way of looking at this for the profession.
Mhm.
Um, you know, many clients come to me for plant-based diets, and their veterinarian has told them that they will be killing their dog. You know, the dog cannot eat, and so it's very judgmental. And I hope that one day in the veterinary community that will change. And
Yeah, I
I
hope that
can't, you know,
I hope there'll be some learning about this because it's obviously not accurate. In fact, it'll go the opposite. They'll often get healthier.
right.
Yeah.
Nutrition, right.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
nutrition, I think, is really important. There's two aspects to it. Nutrition in the sense of it's really high quality food, organic, full array of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, protein, everything. And on the other hand, it's not toxic. It doesn't contain a
Right.
lot of stuff that's harmful to your body. Because again, it's another one of these conundrums, because like the species appropriate diet and that contrast that isn't logical. In the same way, we very much as a veterinary profession buy into the idea that chemicals we call drugs have effects on the body. Well, if there are chemicals in the food, they're going to have effects on the body too, right? But there's a general kind of oh, that's not important.
Right.
The chemicals I use are important drugs. The other ones, well, we'll just, give you something to help reduce inflammation, or maybe some practitioners will say they'll work on trying to cleanse the body in various ways. But they're not really fully acknowledging that these substances are acting like drugs in the animals.
Yes. How hopeful are you that for change, significant change?
Well, it's a good question. I really don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of pressures on people not to make their own food because they're busy. And even more so now with our economies becoming more difficult, people are struggling to have enough money to live on. So they can't afford to take time away from their
Right.
work to do things like this. Hopefully there will be some, I think there are some people, maybe some small companies starting to develop alternative brands that are healthier. I think that's going to be a good move. But how well will it be accepted? It really involves a cultural, I shouldn't say cultural, let's say a change of mindset, right? I mean, it's like what we're talking about isn't totally logical, right? If you say species appropriate diet is really important and you're emotional about it, then it has to apply to you too, right? Besides your animal,
Right.
logically. Or if you say, I have to, drugs are important in the treatment of disease, then you have to acknowledge there are drugs in the food.
Mm.
So it's not logical to ignore that. So it really comes back to how are we using our minds. To me, we have to
Mm.
learn to think clearly and to think logically and not be so swayed by emotional preferences.
I think today you've done something for me, and I'm sure for everyone listening, which is you've combined some really strong scientific evidence and scientific reasons that started your journey along feeding dogs a plant-based diet. And I think you've done such a great job of combining that with a lot of heart and a lot of, just like you said, the world can't continue this way, right? Like one day it's we're at a turning point and hopefully not past the turning point.
Right.
So for me, as you know, for many years, I don't know if you know this, but sometimes when I feel particularly have had a day where maybe someone, you take some online abuse, or you take, it's not so easy. Um, I think of everything you've done and how you do not give in and how you stand by the truth and by your message. And I thank you for that, because you are not, like my husband said, you can have your own opinions and not your own facts. You have the facts, and it's led you to just an amazing, journey. And you've inspired me, and I know you're inspiring everybody else. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I feel good about the way it's gone for me because it just feels right to my heart. This is what I should be doing. Not
Right.
everybody approves of it, and I am, as you say, criticized. But I am sharing what seems to be logical in the sense that it is a fact that animal disease, chronic disease, as opposed by acute disease, I mean like injuries and infections, flu or whatever, distemper.
Right.
Chronic disease more like involving the gland thymus, heart disease, cancer, whatever. That chronic disease has increased steadily in animals. And there's got to be some explanation for it. You know, we know there has to be a cause for it. So it's very reasonable to look for a cause. Now, I may be wrong in identifying the cause, or it may be that what we're saying here to people about that this is an important factor may be a factor, but maybe there's another one we haven't recognized. That's very possible. But it just seems to me so obvious, you know, if you let your mind be open to it, that if you're feeding hundreds of substances that have toxic effects in the body, it's going to have some effect. You know, you're not going to be as healthy as you would be otherwise, right? It just seems like, how could you ignore that?
Right.
So it just seems like it should be given attention to. And it's part of it is, as I said earlier, that the world has changed because, you know, there's more and more chemicals, and there's now there's GMO, right? And now they're talking about genetic modification of people as well as animals. Did you know that? They're starting to move that direction. So, yeah, it's gotten very strange. And I think that it's a challenge. It's a challenge to all of us to sort of make sense of it and how to live with it, because there's a lot of factors. There's all the political stuff. There's all the, you know, so many different arguments over nutrition. There's so different views of medicine. So, you know, it's like you can kind of come to the point where you say, I don't care anymore. I give up, you know, it's just too complicated. But, you know, if you want to try to help your animals best you can, I think giving some attention to the food quality and the food consideration is really important. That's been my experience with it. That's what I finally come to. I think it's a big one.
We can give the health and respect all animals and the planet and everybody. It just seems like a win-win, you know?
It does, yeah. Yeah, because you're not only improving the health of the animal, you're sparing other animals, as you say, which is really nice, isn't it?
It feels good.
Yeah, it feels good. Plus, you know, then there's the whole question of resources. We're also taking action to reduce the demand on resources that we have to deal with. I mean, we're kind of ignoring it as a society, as a culture, but we're going to have to, you know, it's going to be forced upon us. We just don't have enough to keep going as we are, you know, using up the Earth's resources. So all of those come together, and it may even come to the point where we just don't have the accessibility and possibility of feeding a dog the diet that's being fed today with commercial foods. You can't obtain it. You can't buy it. It's not available anymore. So you either don't have a dog or you feed it a plant-based diet. It may come to that.
We run out of land to raise all of these animals, right? And the food to feed them.
Yeah.
Right. And water, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's where it seems to be headed, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, thank you, Dr. Pitcairn. Thank you so much. This has been, you know, a pleasure. And as I said, from the very beginning, I think it was back in 2017 when I was shifting over and needed more information, you were there. And you've been such a huge influence in my life. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, thank you for what you do.
Thank you. I mean, you know, it's standing on giant shoulders. So thank you.
not so high.
You could have hung up on me that day and said, please talk to me. So, thank you. All right. Well, I hope that everyone has enjoyed this, and I'm sure you have as much as I have. This is the opportunity to really speak with a legend in the field, and I hope that you enjoyed it. So thank you. And thank you, Dr. Pitcairn.
Thank you, Diane.